This is Ancient Political Philosophy, Monday, November 9th, 2020, Book 3, The Political Beginning of the Politics. In a way, Book 3 restarts the politics. Book 1 began the subject by looking at the polis. It's been on my mind. At the polis from the viewpoint of nature. That is to say, it's a philosophic beginning, as a philosopher views the polis as part of nature. The nature of the polis, the nature of human beings, the nature of nature. Book 3 looks at the polis the way it comes to light in the eyes of us, the participants in politics, and the way that political life is experienced by the partisan and clashing parties that constitute real political life. We see cities with people and rulers and citizens in them. We see the contestants for rule, for power in political life, kings, tyrants, oligarchs, Democrats big D and Republicans big R, presidents and vice presidents, each asserting different and clashing claims to rule that cancel out each other. Why would Aristotle have two beginnings to the politics? Because the philosophic, non-partisan, theoretical beginning of the politics lays the foundation for the practical improvement of political life, which is the promise of the politics. By starting the politics with nature, the trans-political, that which rests above the political realm and informs the sense of good and bad that animates the whole universe, and the household, the sub-political, that which is beneath the political or institutional and grows up towards it, Aristotle began the work with non-partisan foundations. The non-partisan foundation of the politics will provide a perspective that will allow the reader to weigh objectively the various claims to rule that Aristotle lays out in Book 3. He encourages the partisans to look beyond their own partial views of justice and why their opponents may also have a claim to the truth. This is especially evident in Book 1's discussion of the household, where Aristotle lays out the three forms of rule in the household: master-slave, parent-child, and husband-wife. The first two are unequal relationships of rule, with a superior-inferior. The third equal, with the rule of equal over equal. But even these initial discussions are subtle and nuanced with profound relevance to the question of who rules and should rule in the polis. The master-slave relationship is almost never really just. That is to say, it's based on a permanent equality of reason, and almost always based on force, hence unjust, and lays the basis for the criticisms of tyranny in Book 3. Again, you may find two human beings who have such a difference in reason that one doesn't have enough reason as an adult to govern themselves, since reason is the key to self-governance, and the other who possesses so much reason that it's a naturally or mutually beneficial relationship. But that's a very tiny, almost a null set, I would argue. And as you're going to see, that has relevance. The elaboration of the master, since these relationships are almost always based on force, and therefore almost always unjust, this lays the basis for the criticisms of tyranny in Book 3 and further on. The elaboration of master-slave rule also allows Aristotle to make an important point regarding the presence of reason, the defining human quality, that is also the key to self-rule and the basis for the right of a human being to participate in political rule. If you can't rule yourself, you can't participate in the collective self-governance of the polis either. The same right you have to rule yourself as a human being is the key to your being eligible to participate in the common deliberations that constitutes the common life of the polis. Equality is present in almost all or almost all human beings. So the Democrats, that is to say, the Democrats, as in Aristotle's understanding of Democrats, those who advocate the rule of the masses based on equality in numbers, the poor masses, one might also say, are right. That is to say that human nature is an equality. And the oligarchs and aristocrats are wrong. Radically unequal or exclusive forms of rule fail to see the human in most humans. But that quality is not equally present in all human beings. So the Democrats are wrong. Again, Democrats as Aristotle understands these. And so are the moderns, us, who assert that, quote, all men are created equal. Does that sound familiar? And the oligarchs and aristocrats are right. Some people are naturally better at ruling themselves and others than others are. So again, everyone has reason, but not everyone has reason equally, like any other natural power, like eyesight, for instance. Clearly, we're not all unless you're absolutely blind, and that may be the best analogy of the master-slave relationship. There are people who are totally blind, and there are people who have a mixture, but the rest of us have varying degrees of eyesight. Eyesight is a natural power, the power of the eyes to see, but not everyone has it equally, and some don't have it at all. Add to this point, to this last point about the master-slave relationship, the discussion of rule over parent over child based on virtue, or the real but temporary superiority of the adult over the child, lays the basis for both affirming and limiting the claims of kingship and aristocracy in Book 3, even to the good regimes. In fact, the supposedly best regime, a question we'll come back to. And the discussion of the rule of a husband-wife of equal over equal, whose substance is persuasion, and whose form is ruling and being ruled in turn, although that doesn't quite work out for the wife within the household. This sets the basis of the mean between democracy and oligarchy in polity, a blending of both whose practical completion, as we shall see, is the subject of Book 4. Roman numeral 2. Book 3, as the full emergence of the definition of the regime, also called constitution and polity. Aristotle made the transition from the polis, the nature of the polis, etc., which was the subject of Book 1, to the regime and constitution polity in Book 2. And part of the nature of the regime becomes evident in that discussion. That is to say, what do you learn about the concept of the regime, constitution, or polity, which is, as we saw, that's the subject of Book 2. And here, just a note about translation. For the most part, except for obvious reasons later in today's comments, I'll just stick to the term for the time being, regime, as Carnes Lord, who translated our version of the politics. So what is the actual formal definition of a regime? Some of the answer does emerge in Book 2. The regime answers the question of what the unity of the polis consists of, a shared idea of justice or human nature, a conceptual partnership or an association, rather than the physical or bodily erotic partnership of the household. So what you learn in Book 2 is that the regime is a sharing. It is an association. The polis is a koinonia, an association, a commonality, a having in common. And remember, what he rejects in Book 2 is Plato's model of the regime, including everything, a total unity, which, as you remember, he says, destroys the nature of the city, turns it into a household, which with totalitarian rule, and you have to measure how much toilet paper everybody uses in America. That's what you have to do if you because the polis deals with the critical things of justice and deliberation, which is based on a shared understanding of who participates in that. It's an ideal sharing, a conceptual sharing, not a bodily sharing, which is what the Republic does. Now, in Book 3, more of the regime emerges. It is also an arrangement of offices or institutions that structures power in a polis in a city and determines who the ruling body is. If you look at the key terms list that I passed out when we started Aristotle in the Ethics, politeuma is the word that he's introduced. It means the ruling body of the people that actually have power in a polis. The regime is that. It's an arrangement of offices that says who rules. This ruling body is the body that rules. How's that for brilliance? Meaning it acts. It's an embodiment of the regime's idea of human beings, and it acts to put into real existence the conceptual unity of the regime, and this means laws and policies. So you see two layers of the regime, or parts of the regime, as I'm going to call them in a minute, emerge in Book 3. An arrangement of offices, institutions that structure power and determine who rules, and the actions of that ruling body that actually bring the notion of justice and shared human nature and the conceptual unity, they actually bring it into being. The ruling body is sculpted by the ideas that undergird the regime, and they sculpt the regime in its policies and laws. Now, the last layer of the regime, it begins to emerge also in Book 3, but this is a discussion that's not completed until further on at the end of the book in Books 7 and 8. The regime also creates a class of human beings called citizens, who are educated, shaped, cultivated. This aspect of cultivation of the culture of a polis, that is to say, how the kinds of people that are created by living in that arrangement to become a certain type of human being. And again, as I said, this is completed in books 7 and 8. This is why, and this is meant to be somewhat tongue-in-cheek, the next several comments, but somewhat real. This is why Americans are loud and obnoxious, and optimistic and good-natured and superficial, and everyone dresses like slobs. I'm not one to speak, but I've always thought that blue jeans were remarkably pedestrian. And yet every American wears blue jeans all the time, even Bill Gates, the richest human being in the world, or whoever used to be. And in a way, our mode of dress and our informal mode of dress, which again, I'm not one to complain, um, shows that we essentially believe people are equal. In aristocratic France, you would never have found an aristocrat dressing like a peasant unless it was a costume ball. Um, and that's why French people like wine and lovemaking and cook everything with butter, even snails. Um, and why Japanese people are polite and self-contained and given to social ritual, and Britons are stuffy and class-conscious with terrible music and cooking. A friend of mine in graduate school once said the English don't so much like music as the sound that it makes, the noise that it makes. And if you've ever had British cooking, you just boil everything so it stops moving and has no flavor. Um, each regime stamps its way of life and culture on the human beings who live under it. Perhaps this is why our friendship, as sketched out in the ethics, becomes irrelevant. Political citizens are political friends. And if you've ever traveled in another country, you can see Americans a mile away. We just stick out. But every regime creates a certain culture, and that's what the citizens swim in. So to sum up and speak somewhat schematically, in the same way that psychologists study persons with different theories of personality, person is the concrete thing, personality is the abstraction that classifies and types persons. Aristotle studies polis, which is the Greek plural of polis, polises, cities, with a theory of polity. Now here I did revert back to the synonym for regime or constitution, which is the Greek word politeia, which we've already talked about, and I've talked about both with respect to the Republic, which is the name of the dialogue, the Republic, and also in the key terms. Here I'm switching it around and using it so you can see the connection between person, personality, polis, polity, politeia, polity. Aristotle studies polis, with a theory of polity, a constitutional regime. Different psychological theories posit parts to personality, like Plato. Plato is a psychologist in Book 4 of the Republic. And the personality has three parts: the soul, eros, thumos, logos. Freud has id, ego, superego as the parts of personality, the layers or elements of personality, each one with a different function, ergon. Um, and and so what you really begin to see in book 3 is a pulling together of the concept of the polity and the full emergence. So it turns out, if you're looking at the notes, you see the four parts, and you can either visualize this in one of two ways. You can visualize, so the four parts are ideas. That's the partnership in a common idea of human being or justice. The institutions or the ruling body, the arrangement of offices in book 3. The laws and policies and actions of the ruling body, also in book 3, and to some degree in book 4 and the rest of the politics, and a certain citizen culture or way of life, the kind of individual produced by living in that regime, cultivated by that regime. So you can think of these in one of two ways, like as one leading to the other. A certain set of ideas leads to a certain, is embodied in, like for instance, in America. Um, the Declaration of Independence shows our basic idea of human beings, equality. And that leads to the Constitution, where aside from a few minor differences of age and residence, and with the exception of natural birth in the presidency, essentially any human being can become an American citizen, become an American power holder. So the Constitution essentially is a democratic regime. We'll talk more about that in Book 4. And laws and policies. Most American states and the federal government has progressive taxation, where wealthier people pay more percentage of taxes. That's a democratic kind of law, and with a citizen culture way of life. That's why English in America and why French in French Canada doesn't distinguish between formal and familiar, because all languages that have two forms of you that are formal and familiar, like zi, tu, vous, tu, vi, tu in Russian, ni, nin in Chinese, uh, um, uh, tum ap in Hindi and Sanskrit, usted, tú in Spanish, etc., etc. All those languages that have formal and familiar that used to be aristocratic and peasant. You had two forms of you, depending if you were speaking to a social equal or a social superior, formal or social inferior. So those are the four parts of the regime, the Aristotelian understanding of constitution. A constitution has four parts. And so the two ways you can look at this is one leads to the next. Shared ideas lead to a certain set of institutions. Institutions lead to certain policies, which produces a kind of citizen. Or the other way is like concentric circles. At the core is the ideas. The next expanded layer outside of the regime is the institutions. The next layer is laws and policies. And the next layer outside, which you see literally when you see Americans lording over each other in Canada, um, is the way of life. So the book 3 begins. So let's turn to Roman numeral 3 in my notes. Book 3 begins with a discussion of citizenship, because the regime establishes who gets to be a citizen. That is to say, who gets to exercise political power, deliberation, and therefore literally who gets access to his or her own human being. Remember, Aristotle criticizes the barbarian, quote unquote, regimes for confusing female and slave. They treat females within the household like a slave. That means they deny to women that access to their own human nature that constitutes the development of natural potentials. So the question of who gets to be a citizen is a big thing in the city. And three big questions I think come out of this discussion are three big points. The first big question is who's a citizen? And it points to the centrality of the regime in asking this. The answer, who gets to be a citizen, who is a citizen, of course, depends on the regime. So, some regimes call some people citizens that others don't. Jews, for instance, can be citizens of America or Israel or most other countries. I don't think Saudi Arabia allows Jews to be citizens, but not Nazi Germany. And remember, going back to those discussions in Book 1, if you don't have access, as the point I just made, to some form of rule, you don't get to activate your full human potential. You can see that in this discussion of citizenship, some kind of standard or political justice is beginning to emerge that becomes critical for the practical teaching of the Republic. I'm going to argue, or the politics I'm going to argue later on. So B, the second major topic is the coincidence or non-coincidence of the virtue of the good citizen and the good human being. Is a good citizen the same thing as a good human being? That too depends on the regime. It would be very difficult to be a good person in Nazi Germany and probably in most really bad regimes. I have a good friend who escaped from Stalinist Russia. Actually, it was Khrushchevian Russia. I think Brezhnevian Russia, Soviet Union, and made it to Israel and made it to the United States. And she says that one of the bad things about being a Soviet citizen was you hated everyone around you and were suspicious because the regime exercised such totalitarian authority and pressured you to conform ideologically that you could get ahead just by turning in your neighbors for being enemies of the regime, enemies of the revolution. And that created a kind of a natural distaste and lack of friendship among citizens. So, I mean, uh, in a really terrible regime, especially that requires you to do really terrible and unjust things, it's very difficult to be a good person. The ethic shows what a good person is, and a good and just regime would clearly, or probably, shape its citizens in that image and give the definition of justice in this book, which includes the bulk of its citizens in that image. And perhaps you're only when you're ruling in a city, because remember in book 6 of the Ethics, where Aristotle describes the two kinds of intellectual virtue, wisdom, theoretical, but philosophic wisdom, versus practical, statesmanly. It may be only in a statesman, a ruler, a politikos, a politician statesman in a polity, when you're actually exercising rule that you get complete virtue. In the same way that children obeying their parents might be virtuous, but they're not complete virtue because it's their parents who are in some ways ruling over them. So ruling has more of a human virtue in it than being ruled, although, as Aristotle discusses in Book 3, probably it's necessary to learn how to be ruled before you can rule. And that's why the polity, more about that later, political rule like between husband and wife, you don't simply command somebody you have power over if you're essentially equal. That's why I said the substance of husband-wife political rule is persuasion. And the form is ruling and being ruled in turn. Again, in polities, and probably this is what Aristotle is really recommending. That's why in polities, which is the main subject of Book 4, and we'll come back to this because he discusses this kind of regime in Book 3, um, that's why you have to have set terms where people go up to rule and then come down to rule and re-enter the sit-in body. They come up from the sit-in body, exercise power, and come back, which is essentially what the Constitution of America does. And that means being a good person means being knowing and being a good citizen. And even a good statesman requires knowing how to both be ruled and to rule. And the last major question or point about citizenship in the discussion here is you begin to see, as I said a minute ago, the emergence for some kind of standard of distinguishing between good, just, and bad, unjust regimes. As the above 2 points suggest, the full notion of political justice begins to emerge in this book. Book 3, The Common Good, where people are rewarded for contributing to the polis, where you get some of the discussion from book 5 in the ethics applied here, and where the polis really benefits the commonality of the inhabitants. And this is essential for the core of book 3, and this is the main thing that comes out of book 3, is the arrangement of the kinds and types of regimes, constitutions, or polities. So the main product of book 3 is the kinds and types. Aristotle's typology is the famous is the way that social scientists refer to an arrangement of types, a typology, like a typology of personality types. So, and that leads to Roman numeral 4, book 3, its core teaching, the kinds of regimes. So here it would be useful, and I'll refer back to this, the 2 additional documents. One that I passed out earlier, the key terms, that explains the English versions of major terms of Aristotle and Plato's, for that matter, Greek, and the chartograph of regimes. That's just a second. That's this. And note, I even wrote it legibly and used a ruler to draw nice lines, and I used Sharpies to make it legible. So this is a complete expression of the teaching of the kinds of regimes in book 3. So, and there are 3 aspects of this chartograph, or his teaching of the kinds of regimes: the basis of the kinds, and the aspect of human nature, or the substantive claim to rule that each makes, and their relationship to each other, and their ranking. This typology of regimes, this regime scheme, has each of those 3 qualities. Let's turn to them and explain them. A, basis. Being very bright, Aristotle knows how to multiply 2 times 3. There are 6 kinds of regimes. He generates his typology, his types of regimes, not upon sole types, which is what Plato does in Book 8 of the Republic, based on Book 4 of the Republic, but upon an obvious and discernible basis rooted in the visible reality of political life. Who rules and how? You can have either one person, in other words, the one dimension of this going down the left side of the chart, is the number ruling. You can have one person, a few people, or many people ruling. And going across the top of the chart, there are 2 ways they can rule: justly and unjustly. Just meaning for the common good of the whole polis, which is the definition of political justice, or for their own good, for their private good. And that perverts the polis. It turns the rest of the polis into an instrument of the private good of the rulers. Are you listening, Thrasymachus? This is Aristotle's refutation of Thrasymachus. This regime scheme is I'll just repeat myself because I think it's true, is Aristotle's version of refuting Thrasymachus. Politics is power. And so Machiavelli argues, and if you had modern political philosophy, and even Hobbes, who thinks that natural justice is baloney, and rejects Aristotle, who only has 3 kinds of regime, one, few, and many, and Hobbes thinks the distinction between just and unjust is whether you like the regime or don't. It's completely subjective. Aristotle denies that. There is a real thing such as justice, and as we've seen, that's why the cone and the notion of nature, and you need the ethics and all this kind of stuff, because the distinction between good and bad, just and unjust, is not arbitrary. It's not subjective. It's not relative. It's not cultural. Aristotle and Plato, and they have this in common with the Bible, believe in an objective trans-political standard of the good, and here it's relevant. So 2 times 3, 3 varieties with respect to number, 2 varieties with respect to justice. And so the just rule of the one is kingship. The just rule of the few is aristocracy. The just rule of the many is polity. More about that in a minute. The unjust rule of the one for his own benefit is tyranny. The unjust rule of the few, the wealthy few, for their own benefit is oligarchy. And the unjust rule, oy vey, democracy is not a good regime. Just like Plato, Aristotle confines democracy to the non-good regimes. Here, but you see why. And I think, I don't know if you need a modern example, maybe the French Revolution, where the mass of the people loved beheading the heads of aristocrats and priests and anyone who disagreed with them. So democracy is the unjust rule of the many for their benefit, rather than the common good of the whole. Now, Marxism, of course, in the modern world, becomes a radicalized version of democracy in which any inequalities of property are naturally unjust, and therefore only the proletariat, only the masses can rule justly. And when you have as Solzhenitsyn suggests, the great Russian dissident, that sounds fine until you get a death toll of either 80 to 100 million people on your hands, in which case that regime begins to look not so nice. The second major consideration in this chartograph and this arrangement of regimes is what aspect of human nature or aspect of human life or substantive claim to rule. It turns out each one of these rules isn't just a formal one of 2 times 3, one few of many versus just and unjust. Each regime also is based on a certain view of human nature, what it means to be a human being, what counts in human life, whose claim is just based upon what is most important in human life. So it turns out that kingship, the basis of ruling kingship, is an embrace of virtue. And virtue is human excellence. And therefore, you're going to see, in a way, kingship is the best regime. Sort of, as we'll see. And then tyranny is based on force, where one person stays in power by terrorizing everybody else around them through force. Aristocracy is the rule of the few virtuous, which is still based on virtue. And oligarchy, which is the rule of the few for their own good, is based on wealth. Oligarchs really believe that wealthy people are better than poor people and therefore should have more political power or should have rule in the polis. The polity is a very complex form of regime, and again, I have an important point to make about that, the last point in these notes, is based on laws and legal authority. And the laws are able to generalize and balance the elements of the regime better. And democracy is based on equality, numbers, majority rule, because Democrats believe if you're a human being, you're equal, and therefore any other consideration is unfair, and the only thing that should count is how many of you there are. So equality or numbers. The last aspect of this regime scheme, this typology of constitutions or regimes, is they have an internal relationship to each other. And that is rankability. Each regime also stands in relationship to each other and can be ranked from best to worst. And the perversion of the best is the worst. So if you're looking at the chart, you'll see that, and in my notes here, kingship is the best because it's the rule of the one best. Aristocracy, the rule of the few good, the few best, is less good. Polity is the least good. So on the left side, the regimes go from kingship to aristocracy to poliship, from best to less good to least good, and then switching over to the other side, democracy is the least bad of the bad regimes, with oligarchy is the less bad, and tyranny the worst. So the perversion of the best is the worst. The perversion of the less bad is the less good is the less bad, and the perversion of the least good is the least bad. And now the last major question, because then he turns to talking about the different kinds of regimes, aristocracies, kingships, and so forth. But the last real conceptual major question is the best regime. We have these regimes, which is best? Now I'm going to actually argue, and this is not peculiar to me, but I'm going to try to make this clear. Many people argue Aristotle has 2 recommendations: the simply best regime and the best possible regime. And I think there's something to that. I'm going to argue that Aristotle, with respect to practical political life, really prefers practical improvement over unachievable and utopian and really problematic perfection, which is part of his rejection, as we saw, of Plato in Book 2. And again, the last major question here is which is the best regime, and I think Aristotle gives 2 to this: the theoretical best and the practical best. And that's another way of saying the best theoretical regime and the best practical regime, the best possible regime. He has to say that kingship is best because virtue is the best thing in human life. But I really think the regime that he's holding out as the real model for humanity is polity. And I argue this in 2 grounds. And this is where you can see in the discussions of kingship at the end of book 3. Kingship is problematic. You have to be able, for kingship to work, it's like this, and kingship, remember, he says, is like the parent-child relationship in a household. But there's a natural distinction between parent and child. And remember, master-slave would be just if you could find somebody who was so superior of virtue and so somebody so inferior in reason that the inferior needs the superior. But that describes the parent-child relationship. Without the parents, children wouldn't survive, at least until the age of 30. Anyway, so why is kingship problematic? For kingship to be just, to be a practical possibility, you have to be able to distinguish between the superior virtue of the king to rule to justify having total rule over others. And in fact, one kind of kingship that he describes in book 3 is like a natural master or parent over child. One form of kingship is pambasilea, is overall kingship, total kingship, totalitarian kingly rule, the benevolent despot. But he says that's if you find some person of remarkable, super duper virtue who so exceeds every other human being in the polis that you have to make him king. You have to turn, if you found such an individual, you'd have to turn the city over him because everyone else looks like gnats and ants compared to that person. But he actually says this, and I give the reference 1284A5 or so. That actually destroys the polis as a partnership. Uh, think about that. The best regime undermines the existence of the polis. There's a complexity there, a problematic character. And if only one person is ruling, does anyone else get to develop their prudence, their natural virtue, their rule? Would such a city be still based on the common good if it isn't naturally good for the mass of the citizens? And what establishes the basis of goodness is the common good. The polis has to give you some access to rule, not only rule over yourselves in your private sphere, but some participation in the rule of the polis. He even says that such a kingship is even more oligarchic. And don't forget, oligarchy is a bad regime. So would the best regime be bad? It turns out the kingship may theoretically or formally be the best, as I said before, because in the way book 6, which I didn't assign for the politics, argues, it raises the question of the best way of life. Aristotle just spent a lot of effort in the ethics arguing that human excellence, pursuing virtue, is the way to happiness and is the best way of life. But people like other ways of life, and that's just the way things are. So again, one basis for suggesting that what he really recommends isn't kingship, although he has to say it, but not really recommend it, is because of the problematic nature of kingship. The other one stands on a kind of an interesting linguistic point. The name of one of the 6 regimes is called polity. But the word for polity is polity. I love being brilliant. But that, remember, I'll put this 3 ways using each of the 3 synonyms of constitution. There are 6 kinds of constitution. One is called kingship. One is called aristocracy. One is called constitution. One is called tyranny. One is called oligarchy, and one is called democracy. Isn't it interesting that one form of constitution is called constitution? Let's do it using the word regime. I'm just being obvious here. There are 6 kinds of regime. One is called kingship, one is called aristocracy, one is called regime, one is called tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy. Of the 6 kinds of regimes, one is called regime. And finally, using the Greek word politeia, polity. One of the 6 kinds of polities, one is called kingship, one is called aristocracy, and one is called polity. One of the kinds of polity is called polity. One is called tyranny, one is called oligarchy, and one is called democracy. My point here is Aristotle calls one of the forms of the thing by the name of the thing. I think that's a hint. He's pointing that this is the most embodiment of what a regime is or should be. So, but most translations do what Lord does, And what most translations do, they either pick the word constitution or regime for the kind of thing, the political personality of the city that we've described the parts and elements of, the definition of. But then they reserve the word polity for one of the 6 kinds of regime or constitution. But in doing so, which I understand why they do that, they're struggling for a kind of translational clarity, but then you obscure the point that Aristotle's making, that you call the whole class one thing in that class by the name of the whole class. Again, I think that's an important linguistic hint. So what is that regime? Its polity is the mean, between democracy, the least bad of the bad regimes, that argues that human beings are equal, and oligarchy, the less bad of the bad regimes, that argues that human beings are unequal. And the other reason for doing this is when you really look at what most regimes have been in human history, there's been the tyrant, there's been the kings, there have been a few so-called aristocrats. Most of them are actually just the noble-born wealthy families. They're actually oligarchies. Most regimes hover between oligarchy and democracy. So if you can take the 2 least bad regimes and kind extremes, equality, inequality, and find the mean between them, perhaps that's political virtue. The worst of the good regimes is the mean. So what that means, if you look at the ranking of the regimes, the worst of the good regimes, the least good of the best of the better regimes, is the mean between the best of the bad regimes. Therefore, what Aristotle really seems to be suggesting is polity appears to be the way that nature suggests we should be ruled. Relative equals over relative equals, like husband over wife. And that's exactly what Aristotle will show you how to do in Book 4. Again, as we saw when I tried to finish discussing the Republic, these 2 great philosophers, in their different ways, and I think with their different recommendations, lay out for you, the observer, participant, thinker, about the political world. Can you make things perfect? Probably not. You probably shouldn't try, and you make things worse if you try. Can you make things better? Perhaps. If you can't do that, then perhaps you can prevent things from getting worse. And if you can't do that, perhaps you can delay or slow down the decay. And if you can't do that, all you can do is watch it happen, at least understand what's happening. That, at least, is the promise of both Plato's efforts to educate humanity with respect to the nature of politics and Aristotle's. In some ways, these 2 thinkers are very similar, and in some ways they're very different, as we shall see as our consideration of the politics unfolds.